On the night of the 9th of September 1980, one of the largest cargo ships ever built was fighting its way through a violent typhoon in the Pacific. The ship was the MV Derbyshire, nearly 1,000 feet long and towering above the ocean like a 16-story building. She was built to carry enormous quantities of cargo across some of the roughest waters on Earth. She was less than 5 years old, technologically advanced for her time, and designed to survive the demands of the global shipping industry. Yet within hours, the Derbyshire would disappear. There would be no final distress call, no confirmed wreckage floating on the surface, no survivors. For years, the world was left with a simple explanation. The ship had been swallowed by the sea. But the families of the 44 people aboard refused to accept that answer. One father, in particular, began a search for the truth that would continue for years. What he eventually uncovered would challenge the official explanation, expose serious weaknesses in the design and construction of an entire class of ships, and ultimately change the way large bulk carriers were built and inspected. To understand what happened to the Derbyshire, we have to go back to the beginning. In September 1980, the Derbyshire was approaching the final stage of a long voyage from Canada to Japan. She had already crossed the Atlantic, passed around the southern tip of Africa, crossed the Indian Ocean, and continued eastward toward her destination. For the crew, this was supposed to be the final stretch. 44 men were aboard, including experienced officers, engineers, and other members of the crew. Captain Jeffrey Underhill was in command, an experienced mariner who had spent decades at sea. But ahead of the Derbyshire was something far more powerful than any ordinary storm. Typhoon Orchid was moving across the Pacific. The storm was intensifying, and its winds and waves were becoming increasingly dangerous. Under normal circumstances, the safest option might have been to avoid the storm altogether. But the Derbyshire was far from a safe harbor, and turning back was not a simple decision. The ship was enormous, heavily loaded, and built specifically for long-distance ocean transport. Underhill had encountered severe weather before, so the crew prepared to ride out the storm. The ship slowed down and adjusted its course to meet the waves more effectively. That was a standard technique for maintaining control in heavy seas. An emergency message was also sent, giving the ship's position and warning of the conditions. Then the storm intensified. Waves rose to extraordinary heights. For a vessel nearly 1,000 feet long, these were still dangerous conditions. But the Derbyshire was not an ordinary cargo ship. She belonged to a relatively new class of vessels known as OBO carriers, meaning they could transport both oil and bulk ore. The concept was simple but economically attractive. A traditional bulk carrier might deliver one type of cargo and then return empty. An OBO carrier could carry oil in one direction and iron ore on the return voyage, reducing the amount of time the ship spent sailing without cargo. That made vessels like the Derbyshire extremely valuable to shipping companies. She had been built at Swan Hunter on the River Tyne in Britain during a period when the country's shipbuilding industry was under enormous pressure from Japanese and South Korean competitors. The Derbyshire represented the future of large-scale cargo transportation. She was massive, efficient, and relatively new. And yet, somewhere inside that enormous steel structure, weaknesses were already beginning to develop. The crew had no way of knowing that. As Typhoon Orchid moved across the Pacific, the Derbyshire continued forward. Then, sometime during the night, contact was lost. The last known communication came on the 9th of September. After that, silence. No distress call followed. No final message reached the shore. Nothing. For several days, there was no immediate alarm. The ship's owners initially had reason to believe that communications had simply failed and that the Derbyshire would eventually reappear. But she did not. By the 15th of September, concern had turned into an international search. Aircraft searched the ocean. Helicopters joined the effort. Naval vessels swept through the area around the ship's last known position. But the searchers found almost nothing. There was no obvious wreckage field, no lifeboats, no large pieces of cargo, no clear sign that a ship nearly 1,000 feet long had vanished beneath the waves. After several days, the search was called off. The simplest conclusion was that the Derbyshire had sunk. But the question that remained was much more difficult: how? A ship that large does not simply disappear without leaving an explanation. The families of the crew wanted answers. They wanted to know what had happened to their husbands, fathers, sons, and brothers. Instead, they were told that the available evidence did not justify a deeper investigation. For many families, that answer was impossible to accept. Among them was Peter Braid. His son had been aboard the Derbyshire, but Braid was not simply a grieving father. He had experience in the maritime industry and understood ships, their structures, and the way they were inspected. He began looking into the circumstances surrounding the Derbyshire's disappearance. And then, a second ship gave him something he desperately needed: evidence. In 1982, another vessel belonging to the same general class, the Tyne Bridge, encountered severe weather in the North Sea. During the storm, serious cracking appeared in the ship's structure. The crew had to be evacuated. When investigators examined the damage, they discovered cracks in an area that would become extremely important to the Derbyshire investigation. The discovery raised an uncomfortable possibility. Perhaps the Derbyshire had not simply been overwhelmed by the sea. Perhaps there was a weakness in the ships themselves. Braid began examining other vessels of the same class. What he found was disturbing. Similar structural problems had appeared elsewhere. Ships were being repaired, sometimes quietly, without the wider public fully understanding the pattern. And Braid discovered another critical detail: the ships were not always being constructed exactly according to the original design plans. Certain structural components had been modified during construction. Those changes might have reduced costs or simplified production, but they also raised questions about the strength and integrity of the vessels. For Braid, this was no longer just a theory. There was a pattern. He gathered the evidence and submitted it to Britain's Department of Transport. But officials did not reopen the Derbyshire investigation. The families were told that the matter had already been investigated. For them, the answer was devastating, but they refused to stop. In 1984, relatives of the missing crew formed the Derbyshire Family Association. Their objective was simple. They wanted to know what had happened, not what was convenient, not what was assumed. What had actually happened to the ship and the people aboard it. Then, in November 1986, another ship provided a new reason to take their concerns seriously. The Kowloon Bridge, another vessel of the same broad class, suffered structural problems while sailing near the coast of Ireland. The ship eventually grounded. By this point, concerns surrounding these vessels could no longer be dismissed as the fears of grieving families. The British government agreed to another investigation. For the families, it was a moment of hope. Perhaps after years of unanswered questions, the truth was finally going to emerge. But the second investigation did not produce the answer they expected. Experts considered different possibilities. Some focused on the ship's design, others examined the extreme weather. But the evidence concerning structural weaknesses did not lead to the conclusion the families had hoped for. The investigation ultimately found no convincing evidence that a catastrophic structural failure had caused the Derbyshire to sink. Once again, the officials' opinions pointed toward the sea. For the families, it felt like the end of the road. But it wasn't, because the biggest question remained unanswered. Where was the Derbyshire? If investigators could find the wreck, they might finally be able to determine what had happened during those final hours. The problem was that the wreck lay thousands of feet beneath the Pacific. Finding it would be extraordinarily difficult. Then, in 1994, the International Transport Workers Federation joined forces with others to support a privately funded search. 14 years after the disappearance, the Derbyshire would finally be hunted for on the ocean floor. The search area was enormous. The Pacific is vast, and the last known position of a missing ship does not necessarily tell investigators where the wreck will be. But the search team had something earlier investigators never had: modern deep-sea technology. And within just 23 hours they found it. More than 4 kilometers beneath the surface, resting on the ocean floor, was the Derbyshire. The ship had been found largely intact. For the families, it was an extraordinary moment. After 14 years of uncertainty, they finally knew where their loved ones had been. But locating the wreck was only the beginning. Now investigators could examine the ship itself. Over the following years, specialists photographed and studied the wreck in extraordinary detail. Piece by piece, they reconstructed the final hours of the Derbyshire. And what they discovered was more complicated than a single dramatic failure. The ship had not necessarily been destroyed by one enormous structural defect. Instead, a chain of smaller weaknesses had combined with extreme weather. Near the bow of the Derbyshire was an area known as the bosun's store. It contained equipment used for deck maintenance, including ropes, tools, chains, and other supplies. The door and surrounding structure in this area had not been built exactly as the original design intended. During the typhoon, the storm placed enormous forces on the bow. At some point, the entrance to the bosun's store failed. Water began pouring inside. That might sound like a relatively minor problem on a ship the size of the Derbyshire. It was anything but minor. Every ton of water entering the bow changed the ship's balance. As more water accumulated, the forward section became heavier. The bow began to sink lower into the waves. And once the bow dropped, the storm could attack the ship from an even more dangerous angle. The waves began breaking over structures that were never supposed to remain submerged. Water reached ventilation openings. Those systems were damaged. Then water began moving farther into the ship. The situation was becoming self-reinforcing. The lower the bow went, the more water could enter. The more water entered, the lower the bow went. And then another vulnerability became critical. The hatch covers protecting the cargo holds were not strong enough for the forces being imposed on them. One of the covers failed. Water poured into the cargo hold, containing the enormous weight of iron ore. The additional water increased the ship's forward weight even further. The bow dropped again. Then, another hatch cover failed. More water entered. The process accelerated. At that point, the Derbyshire was no longer simply fighting a typhoon. She was fighting her own increasing weight. The ship's forward section continued to sink until the forces acting on the hull became overwhelming. Eventually, the Derbyshire disappeared beneath the Pacific. There was no opportunity for a prolonged distress call. No time for a dramatic rescue. The process had moved too quickly. A ship nearly 1,000 feet long had vanished into the darkness. And now, decades after the disaster, investigators could finally see why. The most important discovery was also one of the most frustrating. The Derbyshire had not necessarily contained one gigantic design flaw capable of explaining everything. Instead, several smaller weaknesses had interacted under extreme conditions. A vulnerable opening, structural modifications, weak hatch covers, water entering the bow, increasing weight, and a typhoon powerful enough to exploit every weakness at exactly the wrong moment. Individually, each problem might have appeared manageable. Together, they became catastrophic. The discovery changed the meaning of the Derbyshire disaster. It was not simply a story about a giant ship being defeated by a giant storm. It was a story about how small compromises can become deadly when they meet extreme circumstances. The Derbyshire had been designed to carry enormous loads across the world's oceans. But no design exists in isolation. Ships depend on thousands of individual components working together exactly as intended. A door, a hatch cover, a ventilation opening, a weld, a structural support, a modification made during construction. Any one of them might seem insignificant, but when a vessel is nearly 1,000 feet long and is carrying hundreds of thousands of tons of cargo through a violent ocean storm, those details can determine whether the ship survives. The families had spent years believing that the truth might have been hidden somewhere beneath the surface. They were right. The evidence was literally sitting on the ocean floor. The discovery of the Derbyshire also had consequences far beyond one ship. The investigation contributed to changes in the way large bulk carriers were designed, inspected, and operated. Structural strength became a much greater focus. Hatch covers and bow structures received greater attention. Inspection standards evolved. The shipping industry became more aware of the dangers faced by enormous bulk carriers operating in severe weather. The Derbyshire disaster demonstrated something that maritime engineers had understood in theory, but now had devastating evidence to prove. A ship does not have to contain one spectacular defect to be vulnerable. Sometimes disaster is created by a sequence of seemingly minor decisions. One compromise leads to another. One weakness exposes the next. And eventually, the ocean supplies the force that connects them all. The Derbyshire remains thousands of feet below the surface of the Pacific, far from the people who once worked aboard her, and far from the families who spent years demanding answers. For 14 years, nobody knew where she was. For decades, nobody fully understood why she disappeared. But the people who refused to accept an easy explanation eventually forced the search deeper. They did not recover their loved ones. They could not undo what happened on that September night in 1980. But they did something almost as important. They made sure the loss of the Derbyshire would not become just another number in the long history of ships lost at sea. Her wreck became evidence. Her disappearance became a lesson. And the questions raised by her loss helped change the standards used to protect the crews of ships that followed. The Derbyshire was built to be a steel giant. In the end, it was not the size of the storm alone that brought her down. It was the interaction between extreme weather and weaknesses that should never have been allowed to matter. And that may be the most enduring lesson left behind on the ocean floor. Sometimes the greatest disasters begin with something so small that nobody notices it, until the moment the entire system depends on it. If you found this story as fascinating as we did, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more documentaries exploring the mysteries, disasters, and forgotten stories hidden beneath the surface of history. And if you have a theory about what happened to the Derbyshire, share it in the comments. Your perspective might be the clue someone else missed.